Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Sei Lob und dem höchsten Gut, which translates to let there be praise and honor for the highest good. Fairly straightforward chorale, has a little bit of interesting harmonic movement going on in the beginning, but other than that it's a fairly straightforward chorale. We're going to breeze right through it. So we have one sharp in the key signature, we start with G major, we end with G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major, and our first cadence is actually a deceptive cadence in the key of C major, so we're looking for a point that we modulate to the key of C before the next phrase, or before the ending of this phrase. So after our tonic triad, we have F sharp, D, A, and D. That's 5-6, D major over F sharp. Passing tones in the bass and the alto before we get D, A, F sharp, and D. It's D major in root position. That's a 5-3. We'll just change the figure bass rather than reiterating the Roman numeral. And this C is a non-chord tone, but it's a 7th. We then have G, 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 and D. Very interesting spelling here. 5 roots and a 5th, so no third in this chord, but we know that our tonic G major is what's being implied here. And this is also where I think we're moving to the key of C major. This is now our 5 chord. G major is the dominant in the key of C as well. This E is a passing tone. This B sort of fills out the rest of the chord. And this G right here is also a chord tone. I guess we do have kind of like a passing E minor going on here, but I don't really think it's contributing too much to the... maybe it is. I'll go ahead and put it in there just for safe. Just to be safe. A 3-6 chord here, and it kind of makes sense because we do have some ascending harmony here. Well, yes, it is ascending harmony, but what I actually mean is adjacent harmony, where the chord roots are next to one another in the scale. We have A, C, and F, which is F major over A. That's 4-6, F major. So this F natural is indicative of the fact that we have some C major ideation going on here, regardless of whether we modulate it or not. But it turns out that we did modulate. Sometimes we just see F natural in the key of G if we were just bringing some attention to C and then continuing in G major. But afterwards we have some passing tones. We have B, we have G, we have D, and we have F. That's G7 over B. It's like a passing 5-6-5 chord. A lot of subdivision going on here. 3-4-5, and we would probably expect either 6 or 1 after this. 6 in the from the perspective of someone expecting more adjacent harmony, or 1 from someone who's expecting a tonic triad after our dominant. C, C, E, and E is what we get, which is our tonic triad C major with a passing tone in the alto. And then we get G, D, G, and D. Very interesting. Another thirdless triad in very close proximity to another thirdless triad, and they're both G major chords. I wonder if that's intentional. This E is a non-chord tone, this F is a non-chord tone, but it's also a 7th. And then we have A, E, C, and C. It's A minor in root position. That's our 6 chord. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. So the overall tonality of this chorale is G major, but our entire A section is consistent of phrase in the key of C major, or a phrase that ends in the key of C major, and a phrase that is in the key of D major, but it isn't entirely in the key of G major. It sort of borrows from the form of the previous phrase, where we start in G major and then we modulate to the key of D major for the second half of the phrase. So starting things off, I think this A minor is a common chord. It is going to elide with the key of G major. It is now 2. And this makes sense because the chord afterwards is 5. F sharp, D, A, and D with the passing 7th in the melody. That's 5-6. And then we would expect 1 afterwards, which we get G, D, D, and B. Tonic triad, root position. The alto and the tenor are singing the same note. That's pretty interesting. Passing tone in the tenor, and passing tone in the melody as well before we get G, B, E, and G. It's E minor in first inversion. That's a 6-6 chord in the key of G major. We have a passing tone in the bass here, as well as a passing tone in the upper voices. That leaves us with F sharp, B, F sharp, and A. So we have the makings of either like a diminished, like a 7 chord or a 5 chord, but because this B is here, the chord is really only referenced. It's not entirely like instantiated here in the texture, but there's the idea there. But we are looking towards the idea of D major, or moving towards D major at some point, because we're getting C sharp followed by D here, which is a clear indicator that D is being emphasized, kind of the same way that F natural is indicating to us that C major is being emphasized. So we have E, E, G, and B. That's another E minor chord, so very similar to what happened in our first phrase. We had a 5 chord that went from first inversion to root position, and then we had a modulation afterwards. It's not exactly what's going on, but I do believe this chord here is where we are modulating to the key of D major. It is now our 2 chord. E minor is also the supertonic in the key of D major. So after that, we have some passing tones in the alto and the bass. We then have G, A, E, and C sharp. Kind of interestingly here, you could analyze this as a 5 chord, because you could see this G as an accented non-chord tone, and this A would actually just be a doubled root in the chord. But because the G, I feel like, is the chordal 7th, and it does actually resolve the way I would expect it to, it's just this A as an ornament here, I would reckon 5-4-2 is probably a more accurate analysis here. But sometimes we do see Bach use this figure where we have the 7th of the chord followed by the root of the chord, and it doesn't resolve, which makes me feel like from a functional standpoint it's more so just a root position triad. But in this case, I feel like the G is actually pointing towards this F sharp, and this A is just, like I said, an ornament. So 5-4-2 is what I think is the more sensible analysis, but I think 5 is functioning the same way regardless of the figured bass or the spelling. So afterwards we get F sharp A, F sharp A, F sharp, and D. That's a D major in first inversion. That's where we would expect 5-4-2 to resolve. And then we have B, D, F sharp, and D. More subdivision going on here. This B is a non-chord tone, but it does spell a 6 chord. B, D, F sharp, and D in root position. And I think that makes sense because afterwards we get a 2 chord, G, D, G, and E. Another fifthless chord, but still I think what's being implied here is 2-6-5, because we are thinking in cadential terms here, and Bach loves 2-6-5 chords in cadential situations especially. This A is a non-chord tone, this C sharp is a non-chord tone, and I suppose this, yeah, no, that D is a chord tone, even though it sort of looks like a suspension over the bass. The rhythm looks like a suspension if you didn't pay attention to the pitches. But after the 5-6-5 chord, we would expect some type of, 2-6-5 chord, we would expect some type of 5 chord, which we get a C sharp, G, and E, which is A7. So we have a 6-2-5 and then a 1 chord to wrap up our very straightforward normative cycle of falling fifths progression: D, D, F sharp, and D. 3 roots, broke my pencil lead, 3 roots and 1/3 spelling. Looking ahead, this phrase actually, I didn't mention at the beginning of the chorale, but this phrase right here at the beginning of our B section is very interesting as well. I wasn't sure if I was inclined to analyze it in the key of G major or in the key of D major. I ultimately decided that this was a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major due to the fact that C sharp had so much prevalence in the melody, or just in the texture early on, and Bach avoids C's entirely in the second system. But we do see C natural here, which made me feel like these C sharps were just functioning in a secondary fashion. But because there's 2 of them, there's only 1 C natural. I reckon we're still in the key of D major, continuing on from the A section. So this D going to G is just a 1-4 progression. G, D, B, and D. We also have some passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get B, D, G, and G. That's G major in first inversion, so we'll just change the figure bass. And then we have passing tones in the lower voices. And if you know anything about 4-6 connected to 1, D, F sharp, D, and F sharp, kind of an interesting spelling, but our tonic nonetheless. We know that 4-6 going to 1 in this ascending configuration is always connected by the leading tone. And I say always with mostly confidence, like 98% confidence, because I don't think I've encountered a 4-6 going to 1 chord where in this ascending fashion it doesn't ever have a leading tone connecting the two notes. But sometimes Bach moves another voice as well, and it gives us a fully voiced chord. Not always, but sometimes, and this is one of those cases. C sharp, E, G, and G, which is C sharp diminished in root position. That is our 7 chord. 4 going to 7, going to 1, probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. We also have a passing tone in the tenor before we get A, C sharp, and E. That's our 5 chord, A major, passing tone in the bass as well as in the alto before we get C natural. 5, we are resolving to some type of D major chord, D, A, and F sharp, but we have C natural in the bass, which implies that this is not a tonic triad, but rather secondary dominant, 5-4-2 of 4 in this case, because D also happens to be the dominant of G, as we've learned from seeing previous sections in the key of G. And we would expect G major after this. More specifically, knowing that this is a 5-4-2 chord, most likely a G major chord in first inversion. And that's exactly what we get. We get B, D, B, and G, which is G major in first inversion, 4-6. And here we have G, all 4 voices moving. I immediately think there's a subdivision of the chord progression. And this one, we're not getting 2 entirely different chords. They're both fundamentally or functionally the same, but we do Bach does introduce this passing 7th here. So we have G, B, D, and F sharp, which is just a root position G major 7 chord. So 7, 5, 3. Not super interesting, but Bach does move all of the voices off of the harmonic rhythm, so that's usually an indicator that there's some type of chord progression going on here. We then have A, and E, another open 5th here, and we don't know if it's 5 of 5 because it could be A major. We don't know if it is A minor, and this is a half cadence, but I'm assuming that because I think we're in the key of D major, this is a 5 chord, and then we cadence on 1, D, F sharp, A, and D. Very interesting that we have a 5thless triad again, and in this case it's actually in an important functional position. It occupies real estate that's important because we expect the dominant to resolve somewhere, but we don't have any leading tones in the 5 chord, so there's no sense of resolution, or not as strong of a need for resolution. Okay, looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of A minor, and similar to the previous phrases in the A section, we're going to go to A minor through G major. So G major is served as a vessel to explore many keys adjacent to it on the circle of fifths. So we've seen C, we've seen D, of course we've seen G, and now we're going to see A minor, but not until we go back to G major. Like I just said, this is now our 5 chord, and now instead of G major being our 4 chord like it did here in the beginning of the B section, it is now our tonic triad, G, B, G, and D. We then have passing tones, a passing 7th in the bass, and passing tones in the inner voices here, F sharp, A, and D. It's 5-6, D major in first inversion, and then we have E minor, E, G, B, and G. That's a 6 chord, so a deceptive progression here. The neighbor tone here, I guess you could analyze this as 4-6 as well, because whether this B or this C is our chord tone is up to you, I think, but 6 versus 4-6, they're virtually the same chord, both in function and context, this particular context. Afterwards we get B, G, B, and D, tonic triad in first inversion, that's G major over B, and then we have passing 7th in the tenor and a passing tone in the alto before we get C, E, G, and E. And this marks what I think to be the beginning of the modulation zone, I suppose. Actually, I'm not entirely sure about that. I think with G natural being repeated twice, I think it's this G sharp that starts to rein in the idea of A minor. So actually maybe it's not as broad of a zone as I was thinking. I think actually we're modulating pretty close in proximity to this first beat here. But we do have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have E, E, G, and B. I suppose you could analyze this as 6, E minor in root position, but I don't know, something about this B here feels like an accented non-chord tone, and this just feels like 4 going to 4-6, C major over E. Just because this is something that Bach's been doing throughout the chorale. 5-6 going to root position, or else 4 going to 4-6 here. It just feels like this is something that Bach has been employing over the chorale. 6 going to 5-3 if I didn't say that already. So that's ultimately what I feel like is going on here. But like I said, 6 versus 4-6, they're more or less identical from a functional standpoint, and they're 2/3 similar to one another from a triadic standpoint, because they share more notes in common than they don't. So 6 of one, half dozen another, really. But after our 4-6 chord, we get F sharp, D, F sharp, and F sharp, D, F sharp, and D. 2 roots, 2/3, an interesting spelling, which would be a 5-6 chord, D major over F sharp. And I think because this is turning into melodic minor in terms of A, I think this is where we start our modulation to A. It is now 4-6. Then we get some passing tones, or this B is not a passing tone, but it looks like a passing tone if you look very quickly. And then we have an anticipation here in the alto as well. But if we take an aggregate of all the notes, we have G sharp, B, E, and D, which is E7 over G sharp. It's 5-6-5. We've seen this progression earlier, 4-6 going to 5-6-5 over a subdivided chord progression. It's interesting because it's pretty much the same things happening here. The melody has the 7th of the chord, and it's carried over the whole beat. Pretty cool. So I think we're hearkening back to the idea of the first phrase here. It also makes sense because A minor and C major are similar pitch collections in the sense that they're relative to one another, only real difference being G sharp. We then have F, A, E, and C, or sorry, I keep on mixing up my clefs. A, E, and C. That's that's our tonic triad, A minor, with a passing tone in the alto, and then we cadence on E major, E, B, G sharp, and B. It's our 5 chord in root position. And as we close out today's chorale, we end with a perfect authentic cadence, and we have some cross relations going on here, G sharp versus G natural. And even though I think you could make an argument that there is a direct that there is a common chord modulation going on here, I think with the cross relations and just the abrupt shift from G sharp to G natural, I think that we are just directly modulating to the key of G here. And we're just starting things off with our 1 chord, G, B, G, and B. Lots of interesting chord spellings in this chorale. A great quantity proportionately to the rest of the chords of incomplete spellings, both 2 roots and 2/3 and 3 roots and 1/3 and open fifths. I think it's interesting. Maybe there's something to it. This G is a chord tone, so we don't have to worry about it. We then have F sharp, D, A, and A, which is D major in first inversion. That's a 5-6 chord. And then we have G, D is a chord tone, and B, so non-chord tones in the outer voices, and that spells G, D, D, and B. Again, the tenor and the alto singing the same note like earlier, but this is an off beat or off the harmonic rhythm tonic triad. We then have E, C, G, and C. It's C major in first inversion, which is 4-6. And then we have some more non-chord tones here. F sharp, A, and C. It's a 7 chord. F sharp diminished, so 4 going to 7. Very common subdivided chord progression. And then we get G major, G, B, D, and B, root position tonic triad. This E is a non-chord tone. This G is a chord tone, and I'm seeing a pattern here of Bach's chords being implied on every eighth note in this particular measure, so I'm going to be consistent with that and analyze this as a 6 chord, E, B, G, and B. Bach is introducing at least 2 voices on every offbeat here, so I think it's worthwhile to analyze. After our 6 chord, we get C, C, G, and A. Another incomplete chord, but that would be A minor 7 over C, which would be a 2-6-5 chord. Again, 6 going to 2, that's a good sign, but typically these chords are complete, so it's kind of unusual to see an incomplete 2-7 chord. Regardless, this is kind of an unusual chorale from a chord spelling standpoint, so it makes sense, I think. And then afterwards we get this D as a passing tone, this A as a chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone, so D, A, F sharp, and A. That's a 5 chord, D major in root position, so we have another progression very similar to here. 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, 1, 6, 2, 5, and we would expect 1 here, but we don't get the complete cadence like we did at the end of the A section. Bach has more to say. We go to E minor, E, E, G, and E. Another incomplete chord, but what's being implied here is 6. This F sharp is a passing tone, this B, or it's very decorative. I guess technically, yes, it is a passing tone, but it's very brief, so it doesn't have the same amount of time occupation as a passing tone that's on an 8th note has. But this B is a chord tone, this G is a chord tone, so over the span of the whole beat we have the whole chord. Then we would expect some type of cadence similar to the end of our A section here. We have C, A, E, and G. That's our complete 2-6-5 chord, and we know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. That's A minor 7 over C. This D is a non-chord tone, this D is also a non-chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone. If you take all of the notes, D, A, D, and F sharp, you get a 5 chord, D major, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position, standard perfect authentic cadence to end today's chorale. Lots of interesting spellings in this chorale. Also, a pretty great deal of modulation going on proportionately. Not really something to write home about, but Bach typically doesn't modulate as frequently as he does in this chorale. This is definitely tipping the scale to more of the modulation active chorales that are in his collection. But regardless, that's really all I have to say about today's chorale, fairly harmonically active. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, so you can be notified of my daily upload. You could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. That would help my video be seen by more people, and that means bigger community, more analysis, more discussion. That's exactly what I want for the channel. But regardless of all of that, I want to thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.